Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Marissa Waterman, and I'm the Marketing Director here at the Academy. Today's webinar is titled Generational Perspectives on Artificial Intelligence. Our Executive Director, Dr. Daniel Oerther, and his son, Barney, are our two speakers tonight. During the presentation, you'll be able to submit a question by clicking on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to address each question at the end of the presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Oerther. Dan, how are you? Hi,
I
Barney.
am. Hey, hi, Marissa. Hi, everybody. We're glad to have you with us. As we begin, we'll go ahead and start with what we always start Academy programs with a thank you to our patrons. So patrons are firms, utilities, organizations that financially underwrite and support the programming of the Academy. We're incredibly grateful for the support of these organizations because it helps bring programming from the Academy for free to our members. And so when you get an opportunity to say thanks to these folks for making their contributions to the Academy, please do thank our patrons for their incredible financial support. So what we're going to talk about today is this topic of generational perspectives on generative artificial intelligence. This is my son, Daniel Oerther Jr.
Nice to meet you.
Also known as Barney. And so hence we have Daniel Barton Oerther squared as our presenters. Yes, we are wearing matching Academy polo shirts this evening. And yes, we do have on some phenomenal generational specific attire, these excellent pants that we have here in our photo. So we thought that we might just start today's presentation with just a little bit of sharing. So one of the things that we want to do is just let you know that we're going to be talking in a way that should be accessible to everyone. So we've brought our slangomatic generational translator. And if you're wondering what tonight's presentation is going to be all about, if you're a boomer, we would be giving you the scoop on what is artificial intelligence. If you are like myself and you're part of Gen X, you'd be thinking that this is going to be the 411 on what's going on. If you happen to be a millennial, which is the generation in between us, then you'd be getting the deets about what's going on. And of course, if you were hearing from Barney, he would be actually spilling the tea. So if you've ever heard somebody in the Gen Z talk about spilling the tea, that's the same as getting the deets or the 411 or knowing what's going on. Now, of course, I'm sure many of you want to know the accuracy of what we're going to be talking about, right? And so again, for those of you that are boomers, we are going to give you a presentation that has no bull. This is just straightforward, honest facts. And so for those of you that are Gen X, you'd be saying like, okay, so what does that mean? That's no joke. I have to look that one up. But if we were talking to millennials or we were talking to Gen Z, we might be saying that we're going to do no lie. Or for some of you, you might never have heard this before. Maybe you have from a grandkid or maybe from a younger person. Barney would say no cap. So today's presentation is no bull or no cap. And it is the scoop or the tea on what is artificial intelligence from our perspective, an intergenerational perspective. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share the slides and we're going to get started with our presentation this evening. All right. So I'm coming at this presentation from a Gen X perspective. I was born in 1972, and I was at a university before there was such a thing as the World Wide Web. I actually remember like in the early 90s, putting a web server software on a computer in the laboratory that I was working in. And I like made my first website when I was an undergrad student. We're talking like Web 1.0. I bought my first laptop computer when I was a graduate student in the late 1990s. And it was, one of these big chunky Toshiba things that had external drives. And then kind of that like generational gap is that I got really fancy and had my Nokia phone that was my kind of first mobile phone. And we went as far as to actually have Barney be able to have a flip phone when he had his first phone. So that's kind of the gap between the two of us. I'll turn it over and let him introduce himself.
All right. Hi, I'm Barney. I'm his son. I'm from the Gen Z generation. And so really what I did with a bunch as a kid is I did stuff focusing on like building robot kind of things, like the Gmu robot was kind of my first experience with it. I learned how to control it, how to build it. It was kind of like Lego. Around probably second grade, I got a my first ever drone and I flew that around my room a bunch. That was awesome. And I mainly use like search engines like ChatGPT or Google, but I also watch stuff on like YouTube. So yeah, going into my freshman year this year, so I'm
In
super
high school,
excited in high school.
right?
So I'm super excited.
All right, fantastic. So that just gives you a little bit about like the generational of where we're coming from. And we're both going to talk about how we've interacted with artificial intelligence. But just to kind of give you a little bit of a perspective, I'm going to go back a little bit into my own area of working with mathematical modeling and kind of bring some of that forward. How I'm now starting to bring some of artificial intelligence into the classroom with some teaching at the university. We'll turn it over and Barney will actually get us into some of the details of what it is to work with ChatGTP or to work with Google Gemini from the perspective of a 14-year-old. And then we'll wrap up with some Q&A, but we'll talk about some of the ethical considerations of artificial intelligence in our practice. So in terms of an outline, I'm going to talk about some of my own uses of tools in modeling or tools in computing, the teaching, Barney's use, and then we'll have some opportunities for some questions and answers. So way back in 1996, I actually published my very first ever research paper as a master's student. And the paper was actually entitled The Oligonucleotide Probe Database. So this was a Microsoft Access inventory of pieces of DNA that are used to identify individual bacteria. This is called 16S ribosomal RNA tools. And some of you may have heard those terms, but the bottom line is that from a computing standpoint, or from the idea of mathematical modeling or artificial intelligence, or this whole kind of space, this was back when you would use something called Microsoft Access. Many of us may have used that kind of tool to do an early database. We'd convert the data that we had there into comma separated or tab separated files. Those would then be hosted on a standalone server. We'd run like an Apache web server and have a Web 1.0 interface that you'd go to with Netscape. And we would take input from users. They would say, like, I'm interested in something. We'd parse that using a CGI, and we'd process and then display the output from the database using Perl scripts. And so this is way back in 1995 and 1996. And this would be an example of what we'd think about as kind of like a Web 1.0 interface. We had some content at the university. People were interested in that content. And so we wrote a web interface to allow access to that data through the World Wide Web. Now, move forward a little bit of time. So you come forward about 6, 7, 8 years. And then at that point in time, I was then now an assistant professor running a research laboratory. And I was trying to understand the bacteria that were part of sewage treatment plants. And one of the ways that you understand bacteria in sewage treatment is to create mathematical models that describe how bacteria interact with each other, how bacteria interact with their environment. And so you write mathematical models that are essentially what we would now call like a digital twin, or the idea of a description of a real system, but you'd put it in mathematics. And so some of you might have heard of things like the activated sludge models put together by IWA, or you might think about like EnviroSim's BioWin software. So that era of tools prior to what we now call digital twin, and we're not going to parse out whether digital twin is a new term or just a new branding of a same old term. We're not going to get into that, but we're going to say, what exactly did that look like for us as engineers using computing, using modeling, using interfaces? And so we'd take matrices of informations like kinetic and stoichiometric coefficients. We'd organize those in concepts like material balance, and then we'd dump it into a piece of software that would give us a graphical user interface so we could experiment with a digital version of our real world system. And so in that case, in 2004, I was using a piece of software that's called Stella. It gives you a graphical user interface to finite different equations, and you use building blocks of stocks and flows and converters and connectors, very much mass balance language. And then you would take modeling results and compare them to experimental results. And so the title of this paper was Bacterial Competition in Activated Sludge, a theoretical analysis of varying the solids retention time and the impact on the bacteria that are there, their microbial diversity. And so we created a mathematical model that described how bacteria survived in these systems. And then we'd go out to experimental systems, setting up beakers and making activated sludge systems in the laboratory, and we'd measure the bacteria that were there. And we'd measure them using those little pieces of DNA that we had put together in that oligonucleotide probe database. And so it's kind of tracking from the mid-90s to the early 2000s of how a lot of folks in environmental engineering in the academic setting were using genomic or molecular biology tools and modeling and studying things like activated sludge. So then as that continues to progress, as that kind of moves forward, a lot of folks, myself included, started looking at applications of sanitary engineering or environmental engineering, particularly in communities that lacked access to clean drinking water or clean sewage, right? So yes, we understood how we wanted to have sewage treatment plants in the United States work, right? You think about like BioWin, you think about modeling systems, but more and more, particularly the academic community, started to get into these phenomena of like engineers without borders, the idea of going to other countries and doing good work that was in the humanitarian space. And one of the things that we wanted to figure out in these humanitarian spaces is what kind of interventions were the most impactful for improving people's health. So a very, very simple question was, if we had limited resources as engineers to make people's lives better, to help them stay healthy, where should we invest those resources? Where should we make contributions that improve people's health? Now, of course, you could say, well, if we built a full-scale water system or a full-scale sewage treatment plant in a developing country, that would help. And yeah, that would in a large city, but how do you do that out in small communities? And people are now grappling with this same issue in the United States. How do we make sure that there's sanitary engineering kind of everywhere? And what would be the touch points of where you could actually make your big return on investment? And so to be able to explore that, one of the tools that we brought over from the field of econometrics was the idea of structural equation modeling, or SEMs. Now, structural equation modeling is not actually as complicated as it sounds. Structural equation modeling is a system of equations that includes both observed and latent variables. Let me give you the most classic example. You know what it is to run into a person who's smart. You're like, hey, that person's smart. They feel smart. They're smart. I know they're smart. But if I say to you, how do you measure they're smart? There's no measure for it. It's what we call a latent variable. There are things you can measure, like somebody's IQ or somebody's performance on a test or somebody's GPA. There are things you can directly measure, and those things do correlate to a latent variable. But the latent variable is not directly measured, right? Somebody is smart. Well, maybe they've got a high IQ, maybe they have a high GPA, maybe they have high test scores. So you take the things you can measure, the observed variables, and you compare them to the latent variables, so the things you're interested in that you can't measure. So we wanted to know if people were healthy. And so we said, well, do they have diarrhea? Do they have a water filter, right? So what we wanted to get was good health, and we could look at the things we could directly measure. And so we implemented this in some software called M+, and structural equation modeling is basically simple linear regression coupled with path analysis. Mathematically, it's not really complicated stuff, but it's really powerful because you bring together these latent variables, these things you're interested in, with these directly observed things. And so you then can run structural equation models in what we call exploratory mode. You can ask questions like, what is the relationship between these directly observed things and these latent variables, these things that we're interested in? What things would improve people's health? Would giving them a water filter, would giving them bottled water, would giving them information on how to wash their hands, would giving them refrigeration for their food, would giving them access to toilets? Like, what do you do to help people be healthy? And so once you've created a model in exploratory mode, you then switch over to confirmatory mode. So you go out and you actually talk to people, you collect data, and you push that through your model, and you look for correlations or relationships between the observed variables and the latent variables. And what we discovered was that environmental health and household demographics impacted biofilter maintenance and diarrhea in Guatemala. In other words, if you had more money and you had more school, you would maintain your water filter. And if you maintained your water filter, you got less diarrhea. And so, yes, you could say, well, gee, if Rotary Club helped everybody get water filters, it would help reduce diarrhea. But actually, if people were too poor or too uneducated, it didn't matter if they had a water filter. So you could also say, well, actually, water filters by themselves are not the real solution. It's water filters with some money, with some education. So it becomes important for people to also have a good job and to also have a robust education. And so now you start saying, from a systems approach to solve the problem of health, the latent variable of good health, you actually need a whole system of things to come in and solve that. And you could look at the levels of all these different components. Now, the reason why I'm sharing that is because that's now a generation of tools or a technique that's getting increasingly complicated in how it's looking at human behaviors. You're saying, okay, I've got something that's like straightforward, like a database of information, or I get to these stoichiometric models of describing activated sludge, or now I actually start to get into the space of human behavior and how do I interact with humans. Now, the thing that I've modeled most recently is the relationship between climate change, people's behaviors, and their access to food and income. So it turns out, if we look here at the title, a case study of community engaged design, creating parametric insurance to meet the safety needs of fisher folks in the Caribbean. Hurricanes come through the Caribbean all the time. It is a regular occurrence. We're not going to stop them. Yes, climate change causes more energy in the atmosphere. And yes, more energy in the atmosphere means that storms are more intense and they occur more often. But we're not really worried about the climate change issue. What we're interested in is as these storms come through the Caribbean more often and more intense, how do we use that pattern of storms coming through to help improve the world for fishers, for people who are going out and fishing? Well, the way we would improve health for, let's say, a healthy American is we might say, well, do you want health insurance? And somebody would say, yes, I want health insurance. Do you want life insurance? And somebody would say, yes, I want life insurance. And we say, oh, well, you know what? If you stop smoking, we will give you a better discount on your life insurance. If you stop smoking, we will give you a better discount on your health insurance. And so we can stimulate the behavior of smoking or not smoking as a way to improve health because we look at the model of insurance. Well, in the Caribbean, you want to improve the way fishers fish. You want them to not use drag nets to pull across a coral reef. You want them to not use gill nets that kill the fish they want as well as the bycatch, the fish they're not interested in. So if you give them an insurance scheme that helps them deal with the loss of boats because of hurricanes, you can incentivize fishers to do a better job being more sustainable in their fishing. And the tool that brings this all together is a model. And so a step beyond structural equation modeling is actually thinking about actuarial modeling, or the relationship between behaviors and financial losses and risks that individuals experience. And so the most recent kind of modeling that I've been working on takes existing databases of information like data from Google Earth or sources of data about what's going on with fishers. And it pulls those together with historical storm data and it looks at infrastructure in Caribbean countries. And then you create a mathematical model, an actuarial model that describes the insurance that fishers would need to stay healthy or safe or to not have their boats be lost. And you connect that to their fishing behaviors. And so you can see that over the course of my career, I've increasingly used models to move from simple things like easy calculations to more complex things like people's behaviors. Artificial intelligence, in my view, is just kind of the next logical step. It's relating with people directly for some of their behaviors and their choices. It's giving them access to tremendous amounts of information, which we need to help teach them how to turn into knowledge or wisdom. And so one of the things I'm hoping that I can convince you of this evening is that far from stopping people like Barney from using artificial intelligence, we've got to encourage them to use it more and more to address these really difficult challenges, like things like climate change. Now, to help students understand that, I take some of these same tools that I'm doing in my research and I bring them into the classroom. And so whether I'm teaching undergrad students who are, 18 to 20 years old, or whether I'm teaching graduate students who are 25 years old, I'm teaching them the tools that I'm using in research and I'm bringing them into the classroom. I'm teaching them how to use this model for the Caribbean, or I'm teaching how do we use systems engineering modeling in public health, or how do we use tools for sustainability. And so in these teaching tools, some of the things that I do, or some of the takeaway lessons I use, are two quotes in one example. Barney's heard this all the time, right?
Yeah. All models are wrong, some are useful.
All models are wrong and some are useful, a George Box quote. And of course, the other one, Barney, that you have to deal with all the time, quote from me.
Develop a concrete vision of the future, which you cling to lightly.
So these are mental models, right? And now how do we start to implement these kinds of mental models into practice? And this is the kind of stuff that artificial intelligence helps us with. It takes these kind of like concepts in our head, like all models are wrong and some are useful, or have a concrete vision of the future to which you cling to lightly, what we call the theory of change. And it lets us start to explore these kinds of mental constructs. The other thing that I try to explain to students is that we've got ways of processing or visualizing or interacting with data. And this is perhaps one of the most powerful graphical representations of data showing Napoleon's failed effort to conquer Russia, right? So in red is Napoleon's giant French army marching to the east to go to Moscow. And as you move from left to right, the number of French soldiers drops. So the width of the red line gets smaller and smaller. And the army, as it moves a little bit north, a little bit south, constantly moving east until eventually they fail to be able to take over Russia. And so they start to march back to France. And as they march back to France, it switches from red to black, and you see basically the decimation of the French Grand Army and the loss of Napoleon as the Emperor of France or Emperor of Europe. And so understanding how to visualize and think about interesting data, including this chart by Charles Menard, is ways that we can kind of conceptualize or think about information. And so I like to explain to students that there's practical applications of these kinds of mental models and these kinds of understanding of data. And one of the ones that I teach is the idea of identifying cancer clusters. Now, we all know that correlation isn't causation, right? In other words, when two things occur the same way, it doesn't mean that one thing caused the other. And the example that I give to students is flipping a coin. If I've got a quarter and I flip it, I'm expecting 50% heads and 50% tails. And if I have a handful of quarters and I throw them on the floor, I'm going to expect about half of them to land heads and about half of them to land tails. But if I happen to notice out of a handful of coins that there's a bunch of heads that cluster together, and I ask myself, that's odd. Is there some kind of like magnetic force? Are these not fair coins? Is there something that caused quarters to all be heads in one point on the floor? Well, of course, we all realize the answer to that is that's just random luck. It's a stochastic event. You will get 50% heads and 50% tails, and sometimes you will cluster up your data. How do you know when people report cancer that you're not seeing an environmental cancer outbreak? Well, you've got to have a plausible mechanism, and you have to look at the statistical significance of what you're finding. Is there a difference in the cancer type? Is there a difference in the location or the timing or the population? And the reason why I like to share this example is because I think it's very, very relevant to how we think about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence will give us an answer, even if it's a stupid answer. And so the problem is that when we see an answer to our question, when we see a correlation to our cause, we ask something and it answers. Correlation isn't necessarily causation. It's not necessarily giving us an intelligent answer. It's giving us an answer. We've got to understand whether that answer is of any value or not. So what is it that we have to understand to be able to look into answers and understand, is there something useful there? So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a touch of how I use AI in teaching, or how our university deals with AI or teaching. And then we're going to turn it over and Barney's going to give some examples of how he's using it in his classroom. Now, I teach at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. We've got about 8,000 students, about 6,000 of them study engineering, and every time we make a syllabus, we've got to label it as green, yellow, or red. We've got to label it as, yes, you can, as a student, use generative artificial intelligence. Or yellow, you can, but I got to give you a lot of advice, or red. Now, I find this absolutely fascinating, right? Artificial intelligence, in terms of like easily accessible things like ChatGPT, only became available a couple of years ago. And the first response of most professors in most universities was label everything red, right? Like, I don't know what they're doing. I don't understand it. They don't understand it. I gave them a homework problem and they can answer it super fast. They must be cheating. And unfortunately, a lot of scientists and technologists don't understand artificial intelligence. Their default is to be nervous about it. And so in the classroom, many people are defaulting to labeling their classes as, you are not allowed to use artificial intelligence in my classroom. Imagine how silly it would be if we didn't teach people how to use calculators or how to use Excel. We've got teachers having students in this day and age not learn how to use artificial intelligence. So one of the things that's good to be aware of is that there is this kind of knee-jerk nervous reaction among many people that are being exposed to a new tool, to a new technique, to first respond with, it's changing my perception, it's changing my understanding, so I'm going to reject it. I'm going to stay away from it until I understand it. But I would argue we're scientists and engineers. We shouldn't stay away from the technology. We should find the right way to engage with it. And so how do we go in the classroom and help our students understand artificial intelligence? Well, for many of you, you might go to your favorite search engine. And like, for example, I love to do a Google search. So here's a straightforward Google search. You go to Google and you type in, how should AI be used to support learning in higher education? And these are 3 columns of data that came back from a Google search, right? So Google now, for those of you that haven't done a Google search recently, at the very top of a Google search, it gives you an AI overview. It tells you in artificial intelligence what it thinks is a good answer. And then, of course, Google's got to make money. And so the next thing that falls are things like the sponsored ads. And you might look at these and think like, I don't know, are they any good? Are they, like, we all know how to look at a Google search and interpret it and say, hey, is this useful stuff? And then at some point in time, a Google search will start to return information that other people have clicked on. And that's how Google knows something's good. If somebody clicks on it and reads it, and likes it, interacts with it, then Google's like, okay, well, that must be a useful source. Here's the thing about generative artificial intelligence. It's just this. That's all it is. It's taking what people find to be good, and it's putting it together and serving it up to you. Now, it's more complicated than that, but if you know how to read an output from Google, you know how to understand what's going on in artificial intelligence. The thing about Google is that you can drill down and develop some understanding for all the information that's there. Like, I know that if a reference is on page 5 of a Google search and not on page 1, it's maybe not as good. Doesn't mean it's not good, but it's maybe not as good. With artificial intelligence, it's hard to understand if it's giving you a good answer or a bad answer. Where's the data coming from? Where's the information coming from? How do I go and look at where this information is coming from? And so if I would switch from Google to Google's OpenAI, Gemini, and now I go to an AI system and I ask the question, how should AI be used to support learning in higher education? It now spits out what is a beautiful looking set of answers. AI has potential to profoundly transform. Like, this sounds like it was written by a person, and it is in a sense, right? It's written by a whole bunch of people. Because if you go down here to this last third column where it says sources, one of the neat things about Google Gemini is if you click there on sources, it's going to show where the web pages are that it's pulling all this stuff from. I like Google Gemini as a search engine because, one, I like Google and I understand it, but two, I like to be able to go look for the sources of information. And so if I take this kind of summary and I say to us as an engineer, like, what's the use of AI in the context of teaching? Well, here's some important things. AI can enhance the learning experience. What if you are dyslexic and you like to read stuff from right to left instead of from left to right? Well, AI can switch all the text for you, right? See, current dyslexic people have to force themselves to fit the folks who read from left to right. But what if AI could accommodate people with dyslexia and turn the text whatever way makes most sense for them? AI can be interactive and engaging. It can be accessible and inclusive. It can give assessment and feedback in real time. AI can do an awful lot of things that a teacher does that what we might think of as low-hanging fruit. Did you know something or not? On a very, very low level. It can streamline administrative and faculty tasks. It can help me grade stuff. It can help me organize schedules. It can enhance my research capabilities. But some of the big things that I need to spend time helping students understand and wrestling with myself are things like the challenges and the ethical considerations. Like, whose data is going into the answer that AI is giving me? And where is my AI question going to? Am I giving away state secrets by asking a question on an open AI platform? And if that platform is owned and controlled by an entity in China, and if that entity is hostile to the United States, am I actually giving away state secrets by doing a Google search or by doing the equivalent of a Google search on Gemini? That's a very real question that we should be asking ourselves. So in conclusion, and this comes from Google Gemini, and I think it's a reasonable answer. The effective integration of AI in higher education requires a balanced approach. Universities should embrace AI's potential for personalized learning, increase efficiency, and enhance research, while simultaneously addressing ethical concerns and challenges. All right, so if that's what AI is all about, then how do I coach students to understand it? So one of the things that I do is I explain to students that as a teacher, I have very little to offer you in the form of information. You see, I got a lot of stuff in my head, but my head's not that big. It doesn't have a whole lot of stuff in it. You can go to a textbook or Wikipedia and learn a lot more. What you might be able to learn from me is knowledge. How do I put this into practice? So I like to use what's called a flipped classroom. I have students interact with content before they show up with me, and then I have them think and pair and work with each other. But the thing that I can probably give them is wisdom. What's the value of some of this information? So we can wrestle with case studies and value propositions. And so if I, as an instructor, work with taxonomies created by Bloom et al. From the 1950s, and I think about the taxonomies of in the head, the cognitive taxonomies like remember to create, or I think about psychomotor, the taxonomies in the hands, like from perception to origination. Or I think about the taxonomies in the heart, the affective domain, like how do you listen, but how do you also have ethics and morals? Well, to me, what I'm trying to teach my students is that they can read a cookbook and they don't need me as a professor. They can bake a cake, but maybe they need me to help work with them in a laboratory. But understanding why it's important to feed the poor, that's definitely a space where I can help them have some growth as a student. So the question is are you prepared for the disruption that is coming? Before we move on to Barney giving us some examples, let me share with you what AI is doing and what AI looks like right now.
And edit 100 times faster than us. Sure, but what's the point of speed if we lose the soul? We lose the art? This sunset, can AI really understand why it's beautiful? Can it feel how it can simulate it perfectly? Yeah, but why do we do this? Why do we make movies? To entertain, to make money? Or because we have something to say? Exactly. But if AI can say the same thing faster and cheaper, then what's the point? Maybe the point isn't efficiency
or profit, but humanity. Why do we tell stories?
I guess that's what we need to figure out.
Now, I like sharing that one. I like folks being able to see that. And the reason why I like sharing that one is because that entire video was made by a computer. The computer wrote the script, the computer generated the people, the computer put together that. Everything about that is from artificial intelligence. So somebody sat down with a prompt, and instead of saying, why should we teach students artificial intelligence? They wrote a question, well, how does artificial intelligence disrupt the movie industry? Please put together a video of that. And that's what AI generated. Now, yeah, the prompt's more complicated than that. And yes, there's some more editing that goes into it. But my point is that wasn't a video of people. That was a video exclusively of computer-generated content. So how do we interact with that kind of computer-generated content? One of the things that we want to talk about today is to share this question of artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence as used by the next generation. So lots of us here on this call are kind of like, well, I know the way I would use artificial intelligence. And I want to show you an example of something that I ran across on Instagram, which I find incredibly hysterical. This is a way that kind of the Gen X folks might think about using artificial intelligence.
I got to show you something I just set up. It's called Wall Drop. And honestly, this thing is amazing. It's a virtual background, but not just any virtual background. It's custom designed with your logo as a super realistic sign on the wall. I've already had clients compliment it. If you're on video calls all the time, you got to get one of these. It's a game changer.
Now, the reason why I look at that one and I kind of laugh tongue in cheek about that is because that's a background produced with AI that somebody thinks is like so amazing because they didn't have to go to a marketing consultant to design that. They could just do that with AI themselves. And the way that video is put together and marketed to folks on Instagram is like, man, this is the next best thing since sliced bread. You can use AI to make a background for your Zoom calls. Now, I'm not saying that that's not an interesting thing to do with AI. I'm saying that's a pretty trivial thing to do with AI. And the next generation of folks are going to think about a whole lot more interesting things to do with AI. So I'm going to turn this over and let Barney talk a little bit about his exposure to artificial intelligence.
All right. Again, hi, I'm Barney. I set up my own kind of presentation with my dad's thing. So there's going to be a little drop in quality, but it'll be around the same. I mean, it's not that bad. So, being a freshman in high school, I don't really use AI in a kind of classroom-esque way as me being the teacher. I'm usually more the student, the person learning. And because I am in these classes, my teachers usually don't like me using AI that much. And that's because of how they can think it'll make us cheat. Some of us do. I know some of my friends who have cheated on stuff using AI, but that's not really how I use it. I use AI as more of a tool, which helps me like work with stuff. My sister has done some great things with AI. She works with like her tests. They give her examples how to do stuff. And I mean, I also make a lot of pictures and stuff because I think it's interesting how AI uses like its generative area. And what it does is it takes a bunch of stuff and it creates what it thinks is what you're thinking of. So I don't know how to go forward.
There you go.
All right, sweet. So first, I'm gonna show you what a person around my generation of my age would kind of type on different, AI sites. So these are both ChatGPT and Google Gemini. So this is me typing, and this is what I type about. So let me think of a good one. Who's better? LeBron James or Michael Jordan? That's a problem that's come up a lot in recent years in my generation. Very difficult problem. The debate between LeBron James and Michael Jordan is one of the most iconic in sports. There's no definitive answer, but here's a breakdown of their greatness based on angles. And of course, ChatGPT, with all of Apple's research, is able to bring up stuff like this, where they're able to take the stuff that it comes from a search engine and it's able to take that and put it into a short thing. Now, of course, because there is no definitive answer and because it's still only an AI, it can itself create an answer and instead really just take what it knows and just give you a basic definition of that. So it's not perfect, but I mean, people aren't perfect either. So you just have to take it with a grain of salt, in my opinion. So, you know, like it says here at the end, older fans and purists lean towards Jordan, while younger fans and modern analysts often lean towards LeBron for his total package. I personally agree with LeBron James because LeBron James is an awesome basketball player and one of the best of our time. He is probably the best there ever will be and ever is. So now we will go to Google Gemini and I will write the same prompt in. Let me just yeah, there we go. So now I'm changing over to this one. Okay, now I'll ask again. Who's better? Sorry, I'm a little slow. I'm not a pro typer. Boom. Who's better, LeBron James or Michael Jordan? Now, a Gemini, the way it's different than Apple and ChatGPT in a way is that, uh Gemini is owned by Google. So really with Google can really only take things it has into its consideration. Well, because Apple is its own thing and it doesn't really have a search engine, it can really take from anywhere. And of course, most places use the same search engine answers, but in some cases, you'll find that maybe DuckDuckGo will have a different answer than Google. And that's because Apple is able to take all of the responses, while Google can only really take the Google responses. So here's the Google response. The debate about whether LeBron James or Michael Jordan is better is one of the most enduring and highly debated topics in basketball. There's no single definitive answers as both players are phenomenal and achieved incredible things in different eras with different playing styles. So as you can see, it's about the exact same thing as what ChatGPT said, but the difference I would say is that this is probably a little bit more Google based, and you can find with Apple, it will probably be a more around all rounder answer. I personally would go with the Google based answer more because I think Google has one of the more uh best ways to look at the stuff. While with Apple, of course, it can take from good places, but it can also take from some bad places. So with our answer, it says both LeBron James and Michael Jordan are undeniably two of the greatest basketball players of all time. And the debate would be likely continue for generations. And as you see here, they don't say that for some people it's better, for some people the other one's better. Instead, they just say they're both really great and there's no real option here. So as you can see, there is a difference there between ChatGPT and Google Gemini. And like I said before, that's just because of the way that they both use their search engines. All right, now going back to my thing before, I don't know.
Slides. We'll switch you over here.
Boom.
Get this out of the way. There we go.
All right. So then the next thing. So also, like I said before, I like to look at pictures, and these are actually two pictures right here that I have created before the slideshow, and I'd like to talk about them for a little bit. So first off, the first one is create a full glass of wine. And now, when you think about it, when you think of a full glass of wine, I'd imagine you'd think, halfway to the top, that's what you'd say a full glass of wine is. Like a full drink of wine is about halfway to the top. But but if I said what make a glass overflowing, you would pull it to the brink and it would be overflowing. If I ask an AI creator to do that, it will keep it right at the middle because it's taking a collective basis of all the pictures it knows, and it never sees a full glass of wine at the top. Instead, it always sees it in the middle. So even if you say it's overflowing, it will be breaking the glass, but it will still be at that medium. It can never go over. And the same thing with a half full pool. As you can see here, here's a picture. This pool, I wouldn't say is half full. I'd say it's actually pretty deep. It's basically to the top. And that's because there's not many pictures of a pool half full. There's pictures of a pool that is completely empty, and there's pictures of a pool that is completely full. So that way you can see how two different ways AI can take stuff, but it can't take the 100% accuracy of this stuff. And that's why it's always good to use AI as a tool and not a crutch. Because if I didn't know that what a full glass of wine pouring over the top looks like, I would just believe what ChatGPT or Google Gemini says. And that's just not always completely right because, again, like here, this is very simplistic stuff. But if I asked for something very complex, like something my dad works with, and I just took the basic answer without knowing anything about it, I just look like a complete idiot, All right, here's my other thing. So during my 8th grade year, during my school, I always had to do science fair. And I didn't really like science fair that much, but I learned a lot. And this year, because I'm in 8th grade, my teacher let me use ChatGPT to help write my research plan. And with my research plan, as you can see here, this is all around basically me, but mainly part in the rational and how to help me with the other stuff. It's a lot of mine with a little bit of ChatGPT helping me tweak some things to make it a better answer. But if I hadn't known any of the stuff, it would just maybe look like gibberish. It could be completely normal, but how would I know? And that's because I would have to learn the stuff to 100% know about it. So when writing something or working on something, even as simplistic as 8th grade science fair, you always want to know what it is that you're working on and what like the topic is. And if you don't know anything about it and you just let ChatGPT or whatever help you out without knowing about it, it can make you look stupid with all the stuff you're working on. And then so
that's an opportunity if we got some questions.
if we have
I'm
some
going to
questions
look
from
over
me,
here.
right?
I'm going to look over here in the chat.
Well, okay, so it's a lot of talk about
Claude.
a lot of yeah.
Jordan is
the GOAT. That's not true. I appreciate your what you're saying, but it's wrong. I totally understand where you're coming from though, but you're wrong. It's okay.
at least you don't have a strong opinion on it. All right. So the next part that we're going to get into here is a little bit of discussion of picking up on this point that Barney made, which is this idea that ultimately we need to be able to consider the concept. Oh, let me make sure that I've got my screen sharing going. The concept of, do we know the material? Do we understand the material? Are we competent? And ultimately, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, I would argue that that's really where the rubber meets the road. No matter what tool we're using as engineers or as scientists, it's ultimately a question of, are we competent? So if we come back to something simple like the National Society of Professional Engineers Code of Ethics, we're all familiar with the quote that engineers hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. We know those kinds of things. But what we often sometimes miss is this second line. We're really only supposed to be performing services in areas of our competence. And so if we are addressing the use of artificial intelligence, the question is, are we competent in using it? And are we using it in areas where we are competent? The next question would be then how do we train the next generation of engineers and scientists to be competent so that they can use artificial intelligence as a tool? So I would argue that ways that we think about this are we deep expert knowledge people? Are we I-shaped professionals who have a tremendous amount of knowledge in one thing? Now, a lot of people think about the BS in engineering or the BS in science, the bachelors of science. We know what BS stands for. And then people get a master's, so that's more of the same. And then they get a PhD, and that's pilot higher and deeper. So we've got BS, MS, PhD, the I-shaped professional. And then we think about those folks that are very, very I-shaped. They've got deep domain knowledge, and they may actually branch out. They may have a business sense, right? They pick up how to work with customers. They pick up how to work with utilities. They grow their network. They become what we think about as T-shaped professionals. But in a world of convergence and artificial intelligence, in a world where we bring disciplines to collaborate together, the space that I would encourage us to think about is the V-shaped profession. Deep knowledge in our domains, but pointing towards a common future that we all share as humanity. So rather than just drilling down in environmental engineering for the sake of environmental engineering, I'm drilling down in environmental engineering for the same reason that I might drill down in environmental science, or I might drill down in healthcare. I'm trying to accomplish some common goal by drilling down in my knowledge. And so when we think about our competencies, historically we've thought about I-shaped, very deep competencies, or T-shaped, those people that branch out. But I would encourage us in the future to also be thinking about V-shaped professionals, those that drill down towards common futures. Now, if we think about how we learn stuff, and I'm not going to get into showing this YouTube video, but if I wanted to learn something simple, like how to think about head loss in a pipe network, I might go watch a YouTube video of a professor talking about head loss in a pipe network. Or if I wanted to learn about it from Google, I might put in a search like, how do I use computer-assisted design to calculate head loss? And so it would go and it would give me this description of how do I do this. So I know that I could learn how to deal with something simple like head loss by going to something like Google. But what's difficult to do on the machine is to actually, what's difficult to do on the computer machine is to go and actually like experience head loss experimentally. And so an awful lot of that competency is our actual direct exposure to or interaction with the real world, growing up our own personal experience. And so while you might be nervous to interact with artificial intelligence, you might be one of those professors that puts a big red note on your course syllabus that says, no students in my class can use artificial intelligence. I would actually encourage us to look at AI as an experimental setup and to take kind of the approach that Barney's talking about. I need to learn how to use it, and I need to learn how to use it so I don't look like an idiot.
Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
To paraphrase a 14-year-old, it's probably here on my translator of
Exactly.
how to not look like an idiot. And so if I think about performing services in our area of competence, then the question is, what exactly does that look like and how do I get there? And it's not a brand new problem in civil and environmental engineering and environmental science. In fact, this is a paper from 2006 and a paper from 1986. And our current vice president, Chuck Haas, was the one who actually gave me these references. And I just want to highlight some of the language here that talks about what it is to use computer software in general. And I think this applies to artificial intelligence. Is it ethical to use computers to solve problems that could not otherwise be solved accurately or in a timely fashion by hand? Yes. The responsibility to employers and clients and the standard of care create a reality that precludes the regular, in other words, like we can't do hand calculations. It would be a waste of resource. We need to use computers. Conversely, is it ethical to use computer software to solve problems in which the user is not otherwise competent? Well, no. Engineers must use their technical knowledge and their intuition to create designs in which they are fully confident. So whether it's a student from 2006 or a perspective coming from 1986, engineers shall perform services only in their areas of competence. There's good reason for this canon. It would be impractical and unwise for an engineer with experience in designing a transportation facility to design a structural system. Not only would it waste valuable expertise, it would also endanger human life. The same argument can be extended to the field of using computer software. Computers and software may be one of the most exciting and valuable tools to come our way in this century, but in the hands of the wrong person, it may be one of the most dangerous. Before an engineer uses a software package, the engineer should ask themselves, do I have the background to use this? Do I have the background to use this appropriately? And so performing services in our area of competence is actually the purpose of the American Academy of Environmental Engineers and Scientists. In fact, that's exactly the reason why we are such strong advocates for board certification. A board-certified environmental engineer, a board-certified environmental engineering member, a board-certified environmental scientist is demonstrating expertise and competence. In fact, when you get a degree in environmental engineering, and then you get a PE in environmental engineering, and then you move on and get board certification, there are 41,300 people in the United States who hold themselves forward as environmental engineers. And among them, about 2,000 of them are board certified environmental engineers, whether it's in air pollution or sustainability, site remediation or water supply. There are about 84,000 environmental science practitioners, according to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. And about 1,000 of those people are board certified environmental scientists in air resources or solid waste, in sustainability or toxicology. In contrast, or let me pick a different word, not in contrast, in concert, you also could look at board certification in civil engineering. Board certification in civil engineering includes water resources engineering, geotech engineering, pipeline and navigation engineering. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are almost 350,000 practicing civil engineers in the United States. So if we just do some back of the envelope calculations here, with 2,000 board certified environmental engineers in our academy, out of roughly 40,000 self-identified practitioners, about 5% of the environmental engineering workforce is board certified. If we took that same 5% and applied it to the profession of civil engineering, we would expect to see about 17,000 board certified engineers with civil engineering certification incorporated. So the goal for the Academy is to grow the number of people who are board certified in environmental engineering and science, and to cooperate or partner with Civil Engineering Certification Incorporated, which is helping growing board certification among civil engineers. This is ultimately the gold standard to know that somebody is practicing in their area of competency. For environmental engineering, it's clearly the gold standard that we established 70 years ago as the Academy. The folks that get the board certification in environmental science regularly talk about how this is a tremendous credential to validate their credibility. And ultimately, one of the goals for the Academy should be, in a world with more and more use of AI, to ensure that all engineering work requires board certification and that board certified engineers are comfortable and competent working with artificial intelligence. So I hope tonight's presentation has been interesting and informative. I hope it's given you some generational perspectives across Gen X and Gen Z thinking about artificial intelligence. And with that, I'm going to pivot and look here at some of the questions that we've got. I'll read the question and then we'll answer them. So Barney, what are your thoughts on classmates using ChatGPT in the classroom? What do you think about that? Do you think it's good, bad, indifferent? Would you always encourage it? Would you never encourage it? What do you think?
So I'd have to say, probably in my educational area, just being 14, 15, I'd have to say it really all comes down to the person's like ability to understand what's good and what's wrong, to understand that you should be able to use ChatGPT or Google Gemini as a way to actually help yourself and not just get by without doing any of the work. So I'd say people should use it, but I think what we really need to do is find a way or some class or something to help people understand what's the real way to use ChatGPT and stuff like that without making it fully relied on, but also being able to help us. So I say full with it, but also you need some help to understand it, especially with younger people.
So to jump on this, right? So what prevents somebody who's 14 from just using it to cheat?
Nothing.
Nothing. So if they used it to cheat, like if, let's say they had a math problem,
Yep.
and they didn't know the math problem,
And I asked it.
and they ask it, they get an answer, and there's like
Unless the answer comes out wrong, which would probably stop them from cheating next time. There's no really way to.
and so if it's a math problem, then maybe when they like do exams work for like do teachers use exams as a way to stop people from cheating?
Right, but that could also mean you just didn't study. I mean, there's ways to hide it, saying, "Oh, I just didn't study." Stuff like that. I would have to say, yeah.
And then how about like in an English class, if you're writing an essay, do you find that people will tend to use it to cheat for that?
Sorry, what's the
Like in
question?
an English class, if they're supposed to write an essay, like a composition, like
Mhm.
write an essay on something.
Yep.
Do you find students like using it?
To cheat?
Yeah.
Yes, I have. Well, I know one guy who has used it multiple times, and now he's not allowed to use a computer to write out his essays. He has to write it all by hand because of how many times he's cheated using.
Okay. So what would be a way that you would use it that you wouldn't, that you would say is not cheating? Like if you had to write an essay
So
and you were allowed to use AI, how would you use it?
for a couple of ways, I would take a cumulative of what I really want to do in my story, and I could use it to find a thing to put into my story and like a basic, like a bone structure, and then flush it out. But also, what I could do
So you would
is
use AI to make an outline, or you would
make
put the
a
outline in?
to make so I would give like what I want as an outline, could give me a hard outline, and then I could flush it out myself without using it to. So it's, you know, it's good, it's strong, but then it's also very human and it's very real. It's not something that is just a Google search bar that is trying to do its best it can. It's really human, but it has a strong bone structure.
And how would you use AI to help you, let's say, like in a math class?
In a math class, so especially what my sister does is what she does is she takes chat GBT and stuff like that, and because it's just obviously a accumulation of all this stuff, it can take little things and it can make out like a pre-test, so that way you can study, so it can make assignments for you, can help you learn, but you can also use it to like understand what's going on more. Like ask it, so why is this? Not what is this? Ask why is this, to help
Okay.
understand what it is instead of.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Um, let's see. Here's a question that maybe I'll take a crack at. How would you structure AI development regulation considering the international race to develop generative AI and the risk to individual rights and privileges in the United States? That's a good one. So how would we structure AI development regulation? So ASCE has some initial thoughts on it. Bloomberg's got some initial legal thoughts on artificial intelligence. One of the interesting debates that I've been following in artificial intelligence is on and I'm loosely using the word engineering. I don't like when people use it this way, but people refer to it as engineering their AI prompts, right? So as Barney's pointing out, artificial intelligence is drawing from whatever source you ask it to draw from. So it's got to be trained somewhere, and then it's got to draw from some kind of data. And so if you're a company and you have artificial intelligence drawing from your curated database of your information, then the answers that it gives you comes from your own data. So this is a very, very kind of like closed rather than open AI way of using artificial intelligence. And it's a safer way, in a sense, to use it. You're not going to get hallucinations or randomness.
Right.
You will only get that Michael Jordan is the best because you won't have any LeBron James nonsense in there. So let's assume that you've got this curated set, right? So that's one way that you can deal with artificial intelligence reasonably. But in the case of regulation, right, if I can put anything I want in anywhere I want, then who has access to what I've put in? It's really no different in artificial intelligence than it is in a Google search. When I type in something to Google, what makes me think that Google's not knowing what it is that I search? And I'll give you just kind of an example of this. My wife and I were having a discussion about a meeting that I wanted to go to, and I needed to wear a tuxedo. And I was having a debate about whether I should rent or buy a tuxedo to wear to this meeting. And the next time I picked up my phone and I opened up Facebook to look at what was going on in the local community, the very first ad that came up was from Brooks Brothers for a tuxedo. So somewhere between Siri on my phone listening to our conversation and Facebook giving me an ad for a Brooks Brothers tuxedo, all that information that I'm doing is already being passed around. And so I think part of what we're dealing with in artificial intelligence is a realization that we're in a very, very open, transparent, sharing information society, and it's just becoming very, very real to people in the context of artificial intelligence. So I think kind of the average person on the street is thinking like, wow, like Big Brother can listen to you and hear what's going on or know what's going on with your AI searches. It feels like they've been able to do an awful lot of that stuff for quite some period of time already. I'm not sure that AI is doing it in a unique or different way. But I think that's a great question to address. Like, where does our privacy and so the thing that I find most interesting from folks that are talking about being engineers of prompts is that there is a big debate going on right now about whether the prompt that you write is actually something that's proprietary, if that's something that is just belonging to you. Obviously, the content, the worldwide information that's there belongs to everybody. That's coming from all kinds of sources. But how do you get AI to interact with that content? How do you write your prompt? So there are folks that imagine that I'm going to write a good prompt, it's going to produce a good output, and I am going to hold that prompt as something that's proprietary to me, and I'm not going to share it with anyone. So if you're looking for, hey, I want to learn something about artificial intelligence, one of the things that I would encourage people to explore is these courses that are on how to do prompt engineering or how to write prompts, because there is actually a certain amount of art to writing a prompt and learning how to write a prompt so that you get the kind of information you're looking for out of AI. And it does look like there is maybe a market space for how to write good prompts, at least things that I'm following and seeing. Other things that we're seeing up here for questions, I'm looking at the chat. Let's see, very interesting. You could go through the draft process of paper and then ask students to use ChatGPT. You could compare and contrast versions of the paper. Yes, that's absolutely true, Christopher. One of the ways that I actually use it when I'm writing something is that if let's say I'm going to write a proposal to a request for proposals. And I sit down and I write what I think is my answer to the request for proposals. I then take my answer and I say to Google, rewrite this or summarize this, and I cut and paste in what is my proposal, and I say to align it with, and I cut and paste in the request for proposals. What are the criteria? And I find that I get good insight from Google taking my document and mapping it or summarizing it to what's in the request for proposals. Now, obviously, if I'm talking about that for like a grant to the US government, and it's something that's public, then I can do that on an open source, like something like Google, and I haven't given away state secrets. If you're working with a company and you're actually doing your own proposals, I wouldn't suggest doing something that open. But that's one of the things that I do when I'm doing writing. What is the best way to inform that AI has been used in either the creation of written text or ideas, or I guess in videos, or in how should a reader be informed that the author used AI in the development of what the author is presenting? And does the use of AI always need to be referenced? So Barney, when you use AI, like for example, for your lab project for 8th grade, did your teacher tell you to note that you had used AI?
So yeah, and I was thinking about this. What I would say with it is that if you're watching a movie, at the very end of the movie, there'll always be the credits, which is crediting the people who were in the movie, who helped support the movie. Even at the start of this presentation, we had credits. Also, at the end of a writing assignment or a paper or anything like that, you will always have your bibliography, which is what you used. And because, I mean, before already it's, oh, this is what I looked up and these are the sites I used. AI is just a group of sites that are all taken together and smushed up. So yeah, I would say you always have to cite it if you're going to cite other things as well.
Yeah, perfect. A formal answer to that, right, is so in journal writing, when we in academics write a paper, there is a statement at the end of the paper that says what is the role of each person who is an author of the paper. So somebody might come up with an idea, somebody might write a first draft, somebody might do edits, somebody might analyze or collect data. There's all these different things. And there's actually a formula of the different kinds of things you can do in writing a research paper. And you have to, at the end of your research paper, make a statement. Like we're familiar with, like Barney said, a bibliography or a reference. We're familiar with acknowledgments, like who gave the funding or who helped out. But we actually put these formal statements that describe who contributed to the paper. There was a debate over the past couple of years about whether AI should be an author. And the answer there is definitively no, it is not an author. There's been debate about in the statements, should you put AI as something that did the work? Did it analyze the data? Did it write a draft? And now what most journals that I interact with have landed on is that you put a statement of how you used AI in the work. So for example, just recently in a paper where I used AI to increase the readability of my abstract. I took my abstract, I put it into Gemini, and I said, make this accessible at a 4th grade reading level, right? And so AI comes back and it takes my abstract and it writes it, rather than in these, sentences that have 25 words, it puts it into a smaller space. It makes it something that's more manageable. It's 10-word sentences with simpler words, right? Goes from Steinbeck to Hemingway. It's easy to read. But I didn't take that abstract and submit it. Instead, I took that abstract and I said, this is great. I'm going to now go back to my abstract that I wrote. I'm going to take this thing that comes from Gemini and I'm going to compare it and I'm going to improve my readability using this edit, using this guide. And so at the end of the paper, I wrote a note that says, I used generative artificial intelligence to increase the readability of my abstract by producing a summarized version, which I then edited. And then, period, I take full responsibility for this final product, period, because it's mine, not the software. So that's what we're doing in academics. It's one of the things that we're adding to the end of papers. Let me see other questions that we've got up here. AI is sensitive to how the question is asked. Here's an example when factoring in both the NBA and the WNBA players. Oh, they got you, right? You just simply ask who's the best of all times, or
No, I asked who's better, LeBron.
you ask who is better of the two. Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. So yes. Okay. So I like this. I like this quote that's in the webinar chat, right? So best professional basketball player judged solely by the 2024 jersey sales is dramatically altered. So that's an interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing that, Jeff. I think you have. I don't see on there where you've shown that Michael Jordan is the best. I still see LeBron James' name on there, which will make Barney happy. Me, not so much. I'm still a Jordan fan, but I appreciate that share.
I also see that it says Caitlin Clark's jersey outsold LeBron's James jersey in 2024. I would like to say that if LeBron James's jersey was more expensive than Caitlin Clark's, of course, because he's a better player, Caitlin Clark would outsell LeBron James because of how more economically easy it is to obtain a Caitlin Clark jersey because she's not as good as LeBron.
Oh, okay. So that's you're saying if they played against each other.
If they played against each other,
LeBron would win.
Would sweep.
Okay. Fair. And that is your decision of what. Okay. No jersey. You're just like who gets the most points.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair. You can tell this is the heated debate in our house. As a professor with students whose first language is not English, how is it to deal with AI? Students using software to convert their language to English and AI. In other words, like I'm writing it in let's say, a native tongue. It's coming over into English. That is a fantastic question, right? So do you want to try it? So what if somebody they don't speak English, or they don't speak English as a first language? They speak English okay, but they speak another language better.
Okay.
They write their thing in another language. Right? Like let's say they write it in Spanish.
Yep.
They put it into AI in Spanish and they say to AI, please write this in English. Please translate it.
Right.
Who's responsible for that translation? The student who wrote it or AI?
I'd say AI.
So AI. And so if there's an error, who's responsible for the error?
AI.
AI. So then can the student turn it in as their work, or would that be unethical?
That'd be unethical.
Okay. So if the student can't make it their own work, they shouldn't turn it in.
Yep.
Okay. Straight from Barney's mouth. So if you are not the one who puts the line at the end that says, and this is my work, period, then don't turn it in.
If, again, you can say, oh yeah, ChatGPT helped me with this, but if you're saying this is 100% my work, when it's obviously not, then at that point, it's just you're lying. It's false information.
Fair enough. Now it's an interesting point that's raised here in terms of that. Now, one of the things I would think about, having worked at the State Department for a while where people had to do translation, both people end up owning it, right? In other words, if the translator botches the translation, or if the original message is wrong, both people end up kind of getting blamed for it. But in the diplomacy space, it's usually the person who originates the message that gets blamed. The translator is looked at as part of the apparatus of communication. So you own it, but the translator made a mistake. But it's a good point. Like, if you don't know enough to check the final product, then is it your product? And you would say, no, it's not.
I said that before as well.
Yeah. Fair enough. It's not your product. All right. Let's see. So I think we have managed to answer everybody's questions. So with that, I will say, Barney, thank you for joining us this evening. We really appreciate having you here. Audience, thank you for hanging with us tonight. It's been a lot of fun to talk about generational differences in how we deal with generative artificial intelligence. Thank you all. Marissa, we will turn it back over to you.
Okay, that was fun. Thank you everyone for all your questions, and thank you to Dan and Barney for sharing your knowledge with us today. We have several webinars planned in the near future, so you can go to aaes.org/events and reserve your spot. Just a reminder, if you're not yet a member and you're considering joining the Academy, please email me and we can discuss our membership options. For all board certified individuals, PDH certificates for this event will be sent out by the end of the week. That's all for now. We enjoyed being with you all tonight. Thank you so much and have a great night.